A reading from the book of Genesis. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is a sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is a sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth."
We're starting today in one of my favorite places, which is not always the Bible. This time it is geoscience, and more specifically the study of tectonic plates, which are the continents drifting. Recently, a new animation was released of continental drift that shows it over 1 billion years. Now, we've had animations before, but they've never been for that long an amount of time. And this time they also used magnetic data in addition to geological data, so it makes it more complex. This story was covered in the Times this past week, so some of y'all may have seen it. And as you can see from the little bit that we're going to show you today during the service, the whole thing is hypnotic. It's like watching a lava lamp, except that the globs of goo that are moving around are identifiably Africa or India or the North American continent, and they move and dance and fall and rise and come together magically. And I wanted to start with tectonic plates today because we are all in just such a mess. Pandemic, plus political extremism, plus vaccination, plus working at home, plus kids at home, plus discouragement and despair and frustration. We are desperate for something solid to stand on, something firm and unchanging and dependable in the midst of the chaos. But life just does not give it to us. This ground that we stand on, for instance, this dark soil that we call Iowa in the middle of the North American continent, feels to us as if it has been here forever, as if it will be here forever. And yet we know that that's really not true. Most of the soil that we experience as Iowa has only been here as recently as the most recent ice age. And the most dependable thing we can say about it is that some of it will flow down the Mississippi, and some of it will blow away in the wind every year. The ground that we stand on seems solid, but it's actually bumping and sliding along at about the rate that our fingernails grow. But we feel like we need something solid. And so maybe we can find something in ourselves, in our identity. Is there something about me that is so fundamentally me that I can always count on it to be there? Now, a good Buddhist will tell you that that whole idea is just completely piffle, that there is nothing solid about our identity. But I don't think we need Buddhists to get us there. I think we can get there ourselves. For instance, think about male and female. Well, that's not exactly permanent and solid. Some of the most beautiful people that I know right now are trans or have no category at all. Black or white, that's hardly solid. Race is a cultural construct, and skin comes in a million different shades, and they shift and change over time. Or my favorite, what I thought was a sort of irreducible me category, introvert or extrovert. I have said for 30 years that my children came out of the womb, one extrovert and one introvert. My oldest son, I have always called my tomato. He is bright red. He's red all the way through. What you see is what you get. He was the perfect preacher's kid because he was so extroverted, even at like 4 months, that if a member of our congregation wanted to pick him up, my son just reached out his arms to be picked up, happy as a clam. My second son, on the other hand, a preacher's nightmare, I have always called him my beet. You have to dig him up, clean him off, boil him, and peel him. And by the way, in his case, you had to do it all after midnight because that was the only time he came out of his room, in order to finally get to that beautiful purple that is Daniel. But that was 30 years ago. Now, my extrovert son needs massive amounts of alone time in order to be functional and happy. And my introvert spends half his professional life making public demonstrations of things. So, identity, not solid at all. What about the church? Can the church be solid? Can we depend on the church to be what it's always been and what we need it to be? I remember visiting a church in California a few years ago where they were modernizing their sanctuary, and one of the members had said to the minister, "You can change things as long as you don't change the altar where my children were baptized." Now, putting aside that we do not baptize at the altar, there was a clear limit to her ability to manage change, and it didn't include changing what she always saw, when she always sat, where she always sat, and looked up. We desperately think that we need the church to not change. And yet, if it doesn't change, it may not attract the new people that we need in order for the church to continue to be faithful and vital. Even the church can't be our unchanging solid. So what do we stand on when the world seems to be disintegrating around us? Sometimes what we have to stand on is words. Here in Genesis, God says to Noah, "I am establishing my covenant." So basically, God is offering words. And the words are, "I promise." Now, you have to remember the context in order to understand this. Earlier in the story, God had seen that the wickedness of humankind was great and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was evil continually. And God's heart was so grieved. Remember, that's how Israel thought about God, that God had a heart that could be grieved and that God had words that could be heard. And so God's heart was so grieved that God decided to blot out every living thing by sending a flood. But Noah had found favor in the eyes of God, and so God saved Noah and Noah's family and 2 of every living thing. And now we are at the end of that story, and God promises never to destroy again. Now, here are some things to notice about this story. Later in the story of God with Israel, remember we're at the very beginning of the story, and there's going to be a long history of God with Israel that gets very complex. Later in the story, there are more covenants, and a lot of them take the form of if-then. If you, humans, do X, then I, God, will do Y. But that's not this time. This promise is all God and is dependent in no way on you and me. God knows who we are, and God still promises. 2, it's a forever promise. It's for all future generations. 3, these particular words of promise have a sign that goes with them. It's the sign of the rainbow. But that rainbow is not for us to remember God's promise. It is for God to remember God's promise every time that God sees the rainbow. And most importantly for me, this promise isn't just to Israel or even just to humans. It's to all living creatures. It covers every living creature of the whole earth, the ferrets, the jackrabbits, the eels, the sandhill cranes. Creation is interconnected, and God promises everything. All of creation will be carried by God's promise. Now, some people read this story as science. Some people read it as history, and so they start doing archaeological digs to find the ark. But that is not what this story is. This story is theology. It's a story about God, who God is, and what God promises. But sometimes, and perhaps for some of you, this is one of those times, sometimes God's words of promise just don't seem like enough. Sometimes they seem like just words. So I want to end today with a different way for you to think about God and words. And I'm going to be reading from a book called Things That Are by Amy Leach in an essay called God, with apologies that she refers to God as he. The hoopoe, which is a bird, the hoopoe and the bat do not say this word, and the word is God. Neither do the eagles or the vultures. The hyena and the wild goat and the night creatures refrain from using it too. A ferret may slip off one's lap, stalk away along the floorboard and escape under the back door and leave. And outside in the dark, nobody knows for certain what escaped ferrets do. But they've never been heard saying the word, God, or seen forming it silently with their mouths. The people say the word repeatedly. And the more they repeat it, the less I understand it. Listening to words I do not understand is like swallowing stones. Some evenings, as I sit there with all these stony words piling up on me, I get so overwhelmed that I become indifferent, and I spit the stones out, and I let the heap fall to the floor, and I walk away, and I go out the back door. The escaped ferrets are out there. The hoopoe and the bat are out there, and I listen to them. I listen to the jackrabbits and the javelinas and the sandhill cranes, for they are all out there. And so is he to whom the over-uttered word refers. He is there because his words are there. His words do not rain down like rocks on those he speaks to. They mount up with wings, or leap through brambles, or swim blackly in ponds. They sleep hanging from trees, stomachs full of hunted insects, or they grow tall and imperious and leafy in the forest. Many, if not most of his words, hope never to be heard. Rooting blindly through their dirt homes or proliferating on the tops of mountains, they are dismayed when they are discovered and they rush away. His words are not repetitive. The only thing his words have in common with each other is that they are strange. and they are themselves. They move on their own through gutters and caves and swamps and the sky, and some of his words, when they get tired of hearing his name over and over and wish to hear him speak, they escape out the back door, like ferrets, like me. God's words are everywhere. God promises. And that's the different kind of solid that we need. Amen.